The satellite images were confirmed this morning by 3 independent analysis organizations that have established records of accurate assessments of military movements in this region. The images show Russian military units, armored vehicles, logistics convoys, artillery, and air defense systems repositioned to areas within 80 kilometers of the Iranian border over the past 96 hours. The movement is not small and it is not ambiguous. The estimate of total personnel involved ranges from 8,000 to 12,000, depending on the source and the specific methodology used to count what is visible in the imagery. Russia has not commented officially. The Kremlin spokesperson, when asked directly about the satellite imagery during a scheduled press briefing, stated that Russian military movements are a sovereign matter and that the Russian government does not respond to speculation based on commercial satellite data. That non-answer is itself information. It is the kind of non-answer that leaves all options open, while confirming nothing and denying nothing. Before we discuss what this might mean, it is worth establishing clearly what we actually know versus what we are inferring. What we know. Russian military units have moved to positions near the Iranian border that they were not in 96 hours ago. The movement is large enough to be visible in commercial satellite imagery, and has been independently confirmed by multiple organizations with the technical expertise to analyze such imagery. The movement includes air defense systems that are specifically designed to protect against airstrikes, which is a relevant capability given the nature of the current crisis with the United States. What we are inferring, everything else. The intent behind the movement, whether it was ordered by the highest levels of the Russian government, or by a regional commander with some degree of operational autonomy, whether it represents a political signal, an operational preparation, a deterrence posture, or the beginning of something more direct, whether it was coordinated with Iran in advance, or whether it is a Russian decision made independently of Iranian preferences. The inference problem matters because the range of possible explanations for what we are seeing is very wide, and the different explanations have very different implications for how this crisis develops. Let's go through the main explanations that serious analysts are considering. The first and most straightforward explanation is that this is a show of political support. Russia and Iran have been significantly closer diplomatically, economically, and militarily over the past several years than at almost any point in the history of their relationship. That relationship has been built through a specific set of shared interests and shared pressures. Both countries have been subject to significant Western sanctions. Both countries have supported the Assad government in Syria, creating a context for direct military and intelligence cooperation. Both countries have been involved in the supply of military equipment. Iran has supplied drones to Russia for use in Ukraine. Russia has supplied Iran with certain military technologies that are significant for Iranian capabilities. The economic relationship has deepened as both countries have sought to route trade through channels that avoid Western financial infrastructure. This is not an alliance in the formal treaty sense, but it functions increasingly like a strategic partnership with real commitments and real coordination. Repositioning significant military units to positions near Iran, while Iran is under unprecedented pressure from the United States, is, under this reading, a political signal. Russia is saying, "We are watching. We are here. Do not assume that military action against Iran occurs in a vacuum. Do not assume that the consequences of such action are limited to Iran and the United States." That signal is intended for Washington, for Tehran, for the capitals of Europe that are deciding where to stand, and for every other government in the region that is calculating how to position itself. The second explanation goes further than political signaling and is operational in character. Russian military doctrine, developed through the Soviet period and refined through subsequent decades of Russian strategic thinking, places enormous emphasis on forward positioning before a conflict develops. Having 10,000 troops and capable air defense systems positioned 80 kilometers from the Iranian border is not a commitment to use them. It is the creation of options that do not exist if those units are several hundred kilometers away. It changes the military planning calculus for American planners in ways that are significant. Any military operation against Iran that the United States is now considering has to be planned with the knowledge that Russian air defense systems are in proximity to Iranian territory. The specific systems that appear in the satellite imagery, if the identification in the initial reporting is accurate, include capabilities that can engage aircraft and cruise missiles at significant ranges. Whether Russian forces would actually engage American aircraft or missiles is a different question from whether their presence changes what American military planners have to consider. It changes it regardless of intent. The presence of capable Russian air defense systems near a potential target area forces American planners to account for the possibility of Russian involvement in ways they would not otherwise have to. That additional consideration changes timelines, changes the allocation of assets needed to suppress potential threats, and changes the risk calculations that go into authorization decisions. The third explanation is the one that the most hawkish voices in Washington are advancing, and that, if true, has the most serious implications of any. Under this reading, what we are seeing in the satellite imagery is not posturing. It is pre-positioning for direct Russian military involvement in defense of Iran if American strikes occur. The strategic logic that would support this explanation goes something like this. A major American military victory in a confrontation with Iran, the kind of clear, rapid, successful campaign that decisively degrades Iranian military capability and produces a strategic shift in the regional balance of power, is something that Russia cannot afford to allow. Not because Russia has some sentimental attachment to the Iranian government, but because such a victory would demonstrate American military dominance in the Middle East in a way that reshapes the global power balance for years and potentially decades. It would confirm American willingness and ability to use military force unilaterally to produce strategic outcomes in regions where Russia also has interests. It would come at a moment when Russia is already stretched militarily in Ukraine and cannot afford a demonstration that the United States is unconstrained in its use of force in other theaters. Preventing that outcome, even at significant risk and cost, might be the calculation being made in Moscow. Whether this explanation is correct is something that nobody outside a very small number of decision-makers in Moscow can say with confidence. But the people responsible for planning any potential American military operation have to take it seriously as a possibility, because the consequences of being wrong about Russian intent in a scenario that involves direct Russian military involvement are catastrophic in ways that don't have historical precedent in the post-Cold War period. The European reaction to the Russian repositioning has been swift, and the statements that have come out of European capitals and from NATO headquarters have been revealing in ways that go beyond their explicit content. NATO's Secretary General convened an emergency consultation of NATO foreign ministers within hours of the satellite imagery being confirmed. The statement that emerged from that consultation was carefully worded and notable for what it included and for what it did not include. It included language reaffirming the collective defense commitment under Article 5. It included language about the importance of de-escalation and diplomatic engagement. It referenced the situation at the Iranian border as a matter of serious concern requiring close monitoring. What it did not include was any statement about what NATO would do if Russian forces became directly involved in a military confrontation involving the United States and Iran. That omission is not an accident. It reflects the fact that NATO does not have an agreed position on a scenario of this type and cannot produce one through a rushed emergency consultation. The scenarios involving Russian military action in support of Iran and how NATO members would respond to such action have not been worked through in the kind of detail that produces a clear policy position. The absence of that worked-through position means the absence of a public statement, because making a public statement about a scenario you have not actually agreed on internally is worse than saying nothing. Beijing's reaction has been, as in other dimensions of this crisis, notable primarily for its restraint. China issued a statement calling for all parties to exercise calm and restraint and to pursue diplomatic solutions. That statement is indistinguishable from the kind of statement China issues in almost any international crisis and communicates nothing specific about China's position on what Russia is doing or what Russia's intentions might be. What China's reaction actually signals is harder to read. China and Russia have a relationship that is closer today than it has been at most points in modern history, shaped by shared opposition to American primacy and shared interest in building economic and political alternatives to Western-dominated institutions. But China also has significant economic interests in stability in the Middle East and in the continued flow of oil through the Strait of Hormuz. China's interest in the specific outcome of this crisis is not identical to Russia's interest. And there are elements of what is happening that are not in China's interest, even if Beijing chooses not to say so publicly. Iran's response to the Russian repositioning has been, according to sources familiar with Iranian government communications, carefully calibrated. Tehran has acknowledged the Russian movement positively, without making specific public statements about its military significance. The Iranian position appears to be that acknowledging Russian presence is diplomatically useful because it signals to Washington that Iran is not isolated, without making specific claims about what Russian forces would or would not do in various scenarios, which would create commitments that Iran cannot actually make on Russia's behalf. The American response in the immediate hours after the satellite imagery was confirmed has been to downplay its significance publicly while treating it with considerable seriousness privately. Senior American officials described the Russian repositioning in press briefings as a matter being closely monitored, but not as a game-changing development. That public framing is standard procedure. Expressing alarm publicly about Russian military movements would be seen as a sign of weakness and would give those movements more leverage than acknowledging them quietly. But the National Security Council convened additional sessions today that were not previously scheduled, and the Pentagon is understood to have adjusted certain aspects of its contingency planning to reflect the changed situation on the ground. The adjustment of contingency planning is the most significant practical consequence of the Russian repositioning in the immediate term. It is also the least visible to outside observers, which is why it tends to receive less attention than the public statements. But it is the real-world change in behavior that tells you what American military planners actually think about what they are seeing. There are historical precedents for this kind of Russian military positioning in moments of regional crisis, and studying those precedents gives some indication of the range of possible outcomes. Russia positioned significant forces in ways that were noticed and analyzed during the 2011 Libya intervention, during the Syria crisis, during the period of maximum pressure in Ukraine in 2022. In each of those cases, the presence of Russian forces or Russian military assets changed the calculations of other parties, even when those forces did not directly engage in combat. The positioning itself had strategic effect without a shot being fired. Whether the same dynamic operates in the current situation is the question. The current situation has elements that are different from previous ones, including the specific proximity to Iranian territory and the specific capabilities of the systems being deployed. The air defense systems visible in the satellite imagery are not the same systems Russia deployed in Syria. They are more capable. Their presence near Iranian territory changes the air campaign planning equation in ways that previous Russian posturing in other theaters did not. The 48 to 72-hour period that multiple actors have identified as critical for the diplomatic resolution of this crisis is also the period in which the implications of the Russian repositioning become clearer. If a diplomatic resolution is found in that window, the Russian troops remain where they are for some period before being redeployed, and the world concludes that the repositioning was posturing that served its purpose. If no diplomatic resolution is found, and military action becomes more likely, the Russian presence near the Iranian border becomes one of the most consequential variables in the most dangerous crisis the post-Cold War international system has faced. We do not know which of those paths we are on. The satellite images tell us where the troops are. They do not tell us what Moscow intends. What they tell us is that the situation is more complex and potentially more dangerous than it was 96 hours ago. That complexity is not manageable through public statements or through the kind of crisis communication that usually accompanies international tensions. It requires direct, private, high-level communication between Moscow and Washington, of the kind that has happened in previous confrontations between these two powers, and that has, historically, been the mechanism through which crises involving nuclear powers have been pulled back from the edge. Whether that communication is happening and what it is producing is not something we can report on from the outside. What we can report is that the situation has acquired a dimension today that it did not have yesterday. And that dimension changes everything about how the next 48 to 72 hours should be understood. We will be here as this develops. The energy dimension of the Russian repositioning is one that receives less analytical attention than the military dimension, but that may be equally consequential for understanding Moscow's calculations. Russia is an energy exporter. Russia's economy is deeply tied to the price of oil. When oil prices are high, Russia's fiscal situation improves. When oil prices are low, Russia faces significant economic pressure. The crisis involving Iran and the United States is, among other things, a crisis that is already producing elevated oil prices. If the crisis escalates into military confrontation that disrupts Iranian oil exports or restricts the Strait of Hormuz, oil prices would likely rise dramatically. That price increase, in a scenario where Russia is not directly involved in the conflict, would benefit Russia enormously. Russia would be selling oil at significantly elevated prices to customers who are desperate for supply, while not bearing any of the direct costs of the conflict. Understanding this calculus does not require attributing malicious intent to Moscow. It requires understanding that Russia's interests in this crisis are not simply about geopolitics or about protecting an ally. They are also about economics. The specific economic interest that elevated oil prices represent for Russia is real and significant, and shapes the Russian incentive structure in ways that are often overlooked in coverage that focuses exclusively on the military and diplomatic dimensions. Whether this economic interest has influenced the decision to reposition troops near the Iranian border is something that cannot be confirmed from the outside. But it is a dimension of the situation that serious analysis of Russian behavior in this crisis has to include. The historical pattern of Russian behavior in Middle Eastern crises also provides context that is relevant for understanding the current situation. Russia's involvement in the Syrian civil war demonstrated a willingness to deploy military force in the Middle East at a level that had not been seen in the post-Cold War period. That involvement was partially motivated by specific geopolitical interests: the preservation of the Assad government as a Russian partner, the maintenance of the Tartus naval base as Russia's only Mediterranean naval facility, the demonstration of Russian military capability at a moment when that capability had been called into question by the performance in Ukraine in the early period. But it was also motivated by a broader interest in demonstrating that Russia is a global actor with global interests and global reach, not a regional power confined to its near abroad. The repositioning near the Iranian border, if it is motivated by the same kind of demonstration logic, is saying something similar. Russia is present. Russia has interests. Russia is capable of acting in this theater. Do not plan your actions as if Russia does not exist. That message, delivered through the repositioning of real military units rather than through words, has a different quality than the same message delivered verbally. Military presence is a form of communication that operates outside the normal diplomatic channels, and that is harder to dismiss or reframe than a statement from a spokesperson. American military planners are almost certainly engaging in intensive efforts right now to communicate with their Russian counterparts through the military-to-military channels that have been maintained specifically for crisis situations of this type. The hotline between the American and Russian military established to prevent accidental escalation in Syria has been used throughout the Syrian conflict to coordinate in ways that prevented direct confrontation between American and Russian forces. Whether a similar channel exists and is being used for the current situation near the Iranian border is not publicly confirmed. But the institutional memory of how to have those conversations, developed through years of careful management of the Syria situation, exists on both sides. The stakes of not having that communication are high enough that it is difficult to believe it is not happening. Two nuclear powers with forces in proximity, in a volatile situation, without direct military communication between them, is a configuration that neither side has any interest in sustaining. The communication that prevents accidental escalation may be the most important conversation happening in this crisis that we are least likely ever to know about. Whatever is or is not happening in those military-to-military channels, the public dimension of the Russian repositioning continues to shape the crisis environment. Every statement by every government in the region, every market reaction, every diplomatic communication is now occurring in a context that includes the awareness that Russian forces are positioned near Iran. That awareness is real regardless of what those forces will or will not do. It changes calculations. It changes the risk assessments. It changes the diplomatic cost-benefit analysis on both sides. Whether the Russian repositioning ultimately proves to be posturing that de-escalates once a diplomatic solution is found, or preparation for something more direct, or a miscalculation that contributes to an escalation nobody intended, is a question that only time will answer. What we can say now is that the answer to that question matters enormously, and that the people who have the most influence over the answer are working in a context of extreme uncertainty, compressed timelines, and incomplete information about each other's intentions. That is the context in which the most consequential decisions of this crisis will be made. We will continue to watch and to report as clearly as we can on what is actually happening versus what is being inferred, and to be honest about the difference.